So Super Pole Riders is a game of pole vaulting polo. It's part of a compilation of 4 local multiplayer games called Sports Friends, which is out for PCs and PlayStations. So the basic idea of Super Pole Riders is that players traverse an arena primarily by vaulting up on a pole vault pole, which allows them to kick a ball that's suspended on a wire towards a goal and score points, right? So that's the basic layout of the game. And what I'm going to talk about today is how I designed the input scheme for the pole, the pole pointing mechanics. The game itself is a gamepad redesign of an older Flash game I made called Pole Riders, a game that I thought had some pretty bad design flaws, which I was really unhappy with. The original game is a browser game, so you're using digital keys to control the pole. And the way that works is you can only rotate the pole towards pointing up with the up key or towards pointing down with the down key. And it moves really slowly and I think inaccurately, and it feels unresponsive and very loose, which is funny but not, not very fun. And I also had this really serious problem, which was that people were blocking the goal with their poles. And this is super embarrassing to admit in front of a crowd like this, but my attempt to solve it was that I made the defending player have really weak arms if he was standing near his own goal, so he couldn't lift up his pole very well, which you can imagine not a very good solution. Doesn't work anyway, because you can kind of like run towards the wall and get it wedged up there, and then the other person can't score a goal. So I was really unhappy with that as well. And I came to see all of those problems as stemming from a kind of a central conflict between the design goals of real-time input schemes for real-time games, and the technical limitations when you're using a physics engine for your games. So in real-time games, there is this thing that you want, which is a really tight correspondence between the control surface and the controlled object. So the classic example would be in Super Mario Brothers, your character is basically instantly in the air when you hit the jump button. And what's more of a kind of apropos example is really the design touchstone for my game is the arcade game 720 Degrees, the old Atari game, which has this special joystick called a spinner, which is a joystick that's constrained to the edge of a circle. So you can see you're only able to move it around the edge of the circle. And then what it does is it makes the skateboard always point exactly where the spinner is pointing, right, no matter what. So there is this one-to-one correspondence between the position of the joystick and the position of the skateboard in the digital realm. And by contrast, games that have fully dynamic physics engines, which we're starting to see more and more of, typically use indirect controls that have a very weak correspondence between the input surface and the game, because at an engine level, you can't manipulate things in the same absolute direct way without risking glitches. So, for example, this is Angry Birds. In Angry Birds, what you do is you pull back on an invisible spring which attracts the bird towards your finger without it mattering whether or not the spring can get the bird all the way to your finger. In fact, if you made it so that the bird stuck absolutely to your finger's position, you'd get glitches if you put your finger over the ground, for example. The physics engine wouldn't know what to do, and you'd get flaws and glitches. Or in Lander, you're applying this gentle thrust to a moving object with this thrust control to gradually alter its velocity. So you can't make the position of the lander correspond one-to-one to the thrust control. You can't even make the velocity of it correspond one-to-one. You're just applying a kind of weak acceleration. And I think we still see a lot of physics-based games that are in that vein, using buttons or joysticks or triggers to control an acceleration rather than have a kind of one-to-one correspondence. And Pole Riders is a physics game, and it has this fully dynamic world, which means the players, the poles, and the ball are all able to push back on each other. But it's also an action sports game, so I wanted the pole to be controlled with that one-to-one correspondence to the controls, which for the sequel meant using an analog stick, partly because we're also targeting consoles and PCs. So those two things are in conflict, since in-game objects can push back on the digital pole, but they can't push back on the real thumbstick. The pole can even get jammed against the walls or against environmental objects or players, in which case it won't do anything when you move the controller, so it's going to completely break correspondence. So when I went to make super pole riders, I had the idea that I wanted to solve or at least reduce that conflict. And so my approach was to start by making 2 grounding decisions, which I was reasonably confident were correct, and then to try and solve all of the kind of secondary problems which bubbled up out of those 2 decisions. So the first grounding decision I made was the pole should always at least try to move so that it's pointing in the direction that you're pushing the analog stick, like the spinner joystick in 720 degrees. So that allows you to at least have the goal of creating a strong or perfect correspondence between the game world, the pole in the game world, and then the analog stick on the gamepad, because the pole is literally mimicking the motion of the thumbstick. The second grounding decision I made was that the pole should be unrealistically heavy, much heavier than the player and the ball. And that's for 2 reasons. So the first is just a technical reason. So the way these physics simulations work is if you've got 2 objects that are connected, they won't be stable unless they have similar mass, which in this case means that the mass of the very first part of the pole, the very first segment of it, has to be close to the player's mass, so the total mass of the pole will be greater than the player. And second, since the pole is the main element that you're controlling, that's where all of the kind of strategy and action happens, I was thinking of the pole as being the real character, right? It's the real avatar of the player. So I wanted it to have physical dominion over the player's body. So it, for that reason, needed to be far heavier than the player as well. So I went about implementing it, and to do that, I anchored the pole to the player's body using a rotational joint. So this is just you can imagine like a little pivot joint that has a motor on it that can apply a rotational force or a torque to rotate the pole. And the question is how fast and how strong should the motor turn? And so as a first step, what I did is I just gave it a proportional control, which just means that the torque of the motor is some arbitrary tunable constant, which I've written here as K, because I did a physics degree in college, multiplied by the difference between the joystick angle, the angle that you're pushing the joystick in, and the pole's angle in the game. So the idea is that it's pushing hard when the pole is far away from the position that you're requesting with the joystick, and it lets up a little bit as you get closer. So I also made it that if the person let go of the joystick altogether, the motor would just switch off. But that leads to the problem of overshoot, right? So the pole reaches its target quickly, but it's so heavy that the weak proportional torque, remember it's going down to a kind of force of 0 at that point, can't stop this super heavy, fast-moving pole when it reaches the target position. You wind up with a wildly oscillating pole that never points where you want it to point. So what I realized is that my 2 grounding decisions were in conflict. So in engineering, I did some research, and in engineering, that sort of overshoot and oscillation is a problem that occurs in all kinds of systems, from the furnaces that heat up large buildings to thermostats in coffee makers and so on. And they have a standard solution in engineering, which is to use what's called a PID controller, PID controller, which stands for Proportional Integral Derivative Control, which takes the proportional control I described on the previous slide and it adds integral and derivative components to the proportional control. Now, that sounds very complicated and technical, but it's not. It just means that you're going to speed up the motor based on its angle relative to the target. That's what we're already doing. But you're also going to slow it down relative to its angular speed and to its average angle over time, right? So you've got, instead of 1 constant K, you've got 3 constants, K1, K2, and K3. It's just tunable constants. And it turns out, there's no magic way of tuning this system, whether it's a boiler or whether it's a video game. The way people do it when they're fixing the furnace in your building is you just tune the numbers manually until you find the right combination of magic numbers. So I did that. Eventually, I tuned these constants to the point where I had a reasonable blend of speed and stability. So with that added, it looks something like that. And with the PID tuned, I was able to find this kind of, I think, a reasonable balance, like as good of a balance as you'll get with a super heavy pole. And so I had kind of first pass of my direct pointing controls that I wanted with the heavy pole. But latency is still a problem here, right? It's taking time for the pole to reach its target, which is a problem, because although it takes time for the pole to rotate, your control stick can be moved around instantly. So it was feeling sluggish, It also breaking that one-to-one correspondence in the controls that I was going for. And I'm spending a lot of time with the pole pointing in a direction that's different from where I'm pointing the stick. In 720 degrees, they have that same problem, but they were able to implement a fix in hardware. This is the underside of that spinner controller. There's a bike chain and a heavy weight hidden under the joystick, so it just resists being moved around too fast. So there's this hard mechanical limit on how fast you can rotate it, which limits the rotation of the skateboard in the game. But that's obviously not an option if you have a thumbstick on a gamepad. It's also not an option to try to rotate the in-game pole as fast as the thumbstick, because that would require near infinite forces in the physics simulation, which will certainly cause bugs and glitches. So I couldn't do that. You need controls that can respond instantly, but you can't force things in physics games to react instantly, especially if they're heavy. So this is kind of a fundamental problem facing most physics-based games, and I don't think it's usually solved well. But I came up with two fixes to it. So the first one is to add some one-to-one instant cosmetic feedback that's reacting instantly to the thumbstick, but which isn't part of the physics world. So if you look closely here, I know it's subtle, but the instant that I move my thumbstick, the player's elbows rotate. So it looks like he's kind of twisting his upper arm to apply leverage to the pole. So that kind of squares the circle, right? We keep our slow dynamic physics world without having glitches, but we're adding fast visual feedback elements that aren't part of the physics simulation. So the controls now respond, at least cosmetically, perfectly to the joystick, at least in these kind of elbows. And so players feel at least like the game is reacting to their input, even if the pole is blocked, even if it can't rotate at all. And I think that reduces the feeling of latency. The second approach I took was to design the game so that the player is unconsciously encouraged to request positions with the thumbstick that are close to the pole's current rotation, current angle. So it's like the player is enforcing one-to-one correspondence between the stick and the pole rather than the system. So how do you do that? Well, this is, again, back to 720 degrees. What they do is they wipe you out if you point the stick in a direction that's perpendicular to the direction you're traveling in. So it gives you this message, you're trying to spin too far, it wipes you out. So what you're doing when you're playing that game is you're trying to keep the joystick pointed in a direction that's close to the direction of travel, rather than making really fast corrections. I couldn't do that in my game. I can't wipe people out because they moved the thumbstick too far, but it did provide the inspiration for the actual fix that I came up with. So while I was tuning the game, I realized that I could make the ball a lot lighter than the pole and the player. And if I made the ball really light, then it would be easy to block it, either with the pole or with your body. So then what you find when you test it is that the players want to spend more of their time in a defensive pole, either with the stick straight up or with the stick straight down, where they're trying to keep the pole still. They're only making these kind of minor corrections, like in 720 degrees, to the angle of the pole. So the thumbstick and the pole are usually pointing the same way. And I don't think people really notice that they're doing it, but they're doing this job of bringing the thumbstick and the pole into one-to-one correspondence for you. So you still have this kind of high latency and poor correspondence if you need to switch the pole's position suddenly, but you're only doing that a small proportion of the time. So by making the ball extra light, I made the correspondence better more of the time. Okay, but that solution leaves me with one further kind of problem, which is it brings back this problem from the original game. So now that I can block with the pole, I can use the pole to block the goal indefinitely, since the ball can't pass through the pole. So I really struggled with that problem. I think is evidenced by the fact that what I did with the Flash version, with his arms getting really weak when he was standing near his goal. But after really kind of thinking about it for a long time, I found some solutions to this in level design. So by adding a dip in front of the goal, so that when you're standing in it, your pole just can't reach high enough to block. That was one solution. Another level, I added a hole in the goal area, so you just can't stand there and defend. And the other thing I did is I made some levels where there's this uncollidable backboard that the pole can't rest against, which means that if somebody comes and pushes you, the pole is just going to be pushed back past the goal and it's not able to defend anymore. So that's how I designed the input scheme for Super Pole Riders. It's a system that doesn't just happen at the level of interpreting the joystick movement and deciding what to do with that joint, but also at the level of how the player and the ball objects are constructed, how heavy they are, and how the levels are designed. And I think, in the end, that does a pretty good job of solving the fundamental conflict here. I've got my fully dynamic physics world where everything can push back on each other, And I've got a control system that corresponds most of the time, at least, to the thumbstick on a gamepad. It's not as good as 720 degrees, but I think it's a lot better than the original version of the game, and it makes pretty good use of the analog sticks. Thanks.